Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany Montague. It is with great pleasure that I announce our guest today, special guest, Ray Kurzweil. Chris DeBona and I know Ray through Singularity University and, of course, through our friends at NASA and the X Prize. Singularity University opened its doors earlier this week, and we thought it would be fantastic to bring Ray here to speak with us. I'd like to share some facts about Ray. As one of the leading inventors of our time, Ray was the principal developer of the first CCD flatbed scanner, the first OmniFont optical character recognition, the first print-to-speech reading machine for the blind, the first text-to-speech synthesizer, the first music synthesizer capable of recreating the grand piano and other orchestral instruments, and the first commercially marketed large vocabulary speech recognition. Among May's many, many honors, he is the recipient of the $500,000 MIT Lemelson Prize, the world's largest for innovation. In 1999, he received the National Medal of Technology, the nation's highest honor in technology. And in 2002, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He has received 19 honorary doctorates and honors from 3 U.S. presidents. In his copious spare time, Ray has written 6 books, 4 of which have been national bestsellers. Ray's book, The Singularity is Near, was a New York Times bestseller and has been the #1 book on Amazon in both science and philosophy. Now, we have a clip to show you of his new film, The Transcendent Man. But first, I'd like you to join me in welcoming celebrated author, futurist, chancellor of Singularity University, and a man with the most remarkable necktie I've ever seen in my life. 2 words, tiny unicorns. Author, futurist, Ray Kurzweil.
The reason I'm calling today is to express my disappointment that you have invited this highly sophisticated crackpot and given him a national forum to express his pseudo-religious predictions that have no basis in objective reality.
If you go back 500 years, not much happens in a century. Now a lot happens in 6 months. Technology feeds on itself and it gets faster and faster. It's going to continue. In about 40 years, it's going to be moving so fast, the pace of change is going to be so astonishingly quick that you won't be able to follow it unless you enhance your own intelligence by merging with the intelligent technology we've created.
This guy is freaky. He says computers will have consciousness in just 25 years.
As we get to the 2030s, you're not going to be able to tell a clear difference between human and machine intelligence.
The big questions of life is, who are we? What are we going to become? What's the future like? And he's got one of the most incredible track records in history for his ability to predict with pretty darn good accuracy.
He's an award-winning scientist and engineer, a millionaire several times over because of his inventions.
Ray Kurzweil.
These inventions may end up causing the worst war that humanity's ever had.
Corporations and governments and societies will be created and destroyed on the back of the technology that this book describes.
The world is flattening, a world that is globalizing.
Inventor Ray Kurzweil thinks that one day humans may be able to live forever.
I want to live as long as I can. I don't want to die. If following Ray's regimen would put that day off, I'm very willing to do that.
I knew there was a reason I was keeping all this stuff, and he kept all this stuff. I do plan to bring back my father.
God is who he is, and our challenge should be to know him, not try to create him.
I'm afraid of you.
It's going to scare a lot of people.
The world is changing far too fast. Nothing like this has ever happened to Homo sapiens before.
These ideas are going to ultimately change the world.
We didn't stay on the ground, we didn't stay on the planet, and we didn't stay with the limitations of our biology.
I think Ray is performing the service of a prophet. That's wrong.
He has used the gift that he was given for the betterment of humankind. That's what I knew.
It will be the universe waking up. Thanks. Just to clarify, that's not my movie. It's a movie about me, as you can see, by talented filmmaker Barry Ptolemy. I am also making a movie based on the book you have, Singularity is Near. That'll be out later this year. And Tiffany did insist that I wear this tie, and she saw me wear it the other night at the grand opening of Singularity University. So it's great to be back. I was here actually on my book tour for this book, so that was about 4 years ago. And you're not quite an order of magnitude bigger than you were then. I think a factor of 5 in employee size. I spoke down in the cafeteria. You were actually building new buildings, including that building, while I was speaking, so there was some distraction. So this is a nice, intimate setting here. And I look forward to sharing ideas on specifically the exponential growth of information technology, which is not intuitive for most of the groups that I speak to. It is intuitive here, but it's the nature of intelligence to make predictions about the future. That's what intelligence does. And the built-in predictors we have are linear, not exponential. When we walked through the savannah 1,000 years ago and we saw something coming at us through the corner of our eye, we made a linear prediction where that animal would be and what to do about it, and that worked just fine. So we have built-in linear predictors, but the nature of information technology is exponential. And that causes an acceleration in technology because each technology builds on the last, so technology gets more powerful and the paradigm shifts occur more rapidly. Took thousands of years for fire, stone tools, the wheel to be adopted. Took centuries for the printing press to affect an appreciable portion of the population. Took 50 years for the telephone to be used by a quarter of the American population. Google was adopted in just a few years' time. So there's a continual acceleration of these technologies. And the roots of that progress really go back to biological evolution. It's the nature of an evolutionary process to evolve a capability, adopt that capability as part of its methods of evolution, so the next stage goes more quickly. The very first paradigm in biological evolution, the evolution of biology itself, basically DNA, a little computer system for evolution to keep track of its experiments, that took 1 billion years to evolve. But then biological evolution adopted it. It's used it ever since. The Cambrian explosion, when all the body plans of the animals evolved, went 100 times faster. And biological evolution kept accelerating. The first technology creating species only took a few 100,000 years, really a blink of an eye. And we can see that if we simulate evolution. We use a lot of simulated evolution, genetic algorithms in our pattern recognition work, and we can see the same type of phenomena. And the implication of all this is that information technology grows at an exponential rate, and it's also at a predictable rate. And the common wisdom is you can't predict the future. And that's true of specific projects. Specific standards are hard to predict. Stock prices are hard to predict. But if you ask me what will the cost of a MIPS of computing be in 2014, or the cost of sequencing a base pair of DNA in 2016, or the spatial resolution of brain scanning in 2018, I can give you a figure. It's likely to be correct. These types of measures have been tracking remarkably predictably for a long time. In the case of computing, it goes back to the 1890 American census. There are a lot of graphs like this that show very smooth exponential growth, a straight line, or even another exponential on a logarithmic scale in many different fields. It's not just Moore's law. Moore's law was just one of the paradigms to do that within computing. That's very often misunderstood. And it's not just computing. Anytime we can measure the underlying information properties of a technology, it grows in a predictable manner. And what's predictable is that it's exponential and it's not intuitive, and that's why even sophisticated scientists use their intuition to make a linear prediction that the current pace of change will continue at the current pace.
It's an axiom that change is a constant, but actually it's not a constant. It's an exponential. And that's why the future is surprising. Halfway through the Genome Project, the skeptics were still going strong, saying, I told you this wasn't going to work. I mean, here are halfway through the project, and only 1% of the project's finished. But that's right on schedule for an exponential progression. You only have to double 1% 7 more times to get 100%, and that's exactly what happened. It doubled every year. It was finished a year ahead of schedule. It's continued since the end of the Genome Project. The cost has come down by half every year. The Internet, I saw the ARPANET doubling in power every year in the 80s. Doubling every year is multiplying by 1,000 in 10 years. So I predicted that by the mid to late 1990s there would be a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people to each other and to rich information sources. And that seemed ridiculous and was heavily criticized in the 80s when the entire defense budget could only tie together a few thousand scientists. People dismiss solar energy today because it's only 0.5% of our energy needs, but it is growing at an exponential rate as we're applying more sophisticated information technologies to the design of materials, such as nanotechnology. The cost of solar energy is coming down, and the amount of solar energy is doubling every 2 years and has been doing that for 20 years. So Larry Page and I were assigned by the National Academy of Engineering on their Blue Ribbon Panel Grand Challenges in Engineering to study the energy situation, since, as you know, Larry's interested in that topic. And a number of these renewable energy sources are growing at an exponential rate, but solar has the most headroom. There's 10,000 times more sunlight than we need. Now, some of it's lost in clouds and some of it's hard to capture, but we only need to capture 1 part in 10,000. And we'll be able to do that ultimately at very low cost with nano-engineered solar panels. There are only 8 more doublings to go. We also studied storage because of the intermittency of sunlight. But it's very easy to dismiss these phenomena, the Internet, the Genome Project, solar energy, when they're only meeting 1% of the goal, and people leave out the exponential progression. That's why the future is surprising. And I'd like to show you just how predictable this is. It's really quite remarkable, even to me. And I got into this because of my interest in being an inventor. Decided I would be an inventor when I was 5. And I remember very well the feeling I had. My parents gave me a lot of these enrichment toys and erector sets, and I felt if it could put these parts together in just the right way, you could create transcendent effects. I did not have that vocabulary when I was 5, but I do remember the feeling that I could solve problems. You could do magical things. And around the age of 12, I discovered the computer, and not long after that, I realized that timing was critical to being successful as an inventor. Most inventors get their gadgets to work. As you do, we do some early-stage investing and mentoring. We get business plans and technology plans. 95% of those groups would build exactly what they say if given the resources, but at least 95% of those projects would fail because the timing is wrong. You have to have the right idea at the right time, such as the reverse engineering of links that Larry and Sergey pioneered over a decade ago. And if you're in the right place at the right time with the right idea, you have a chance of succeeding. So realizing that, I began to study technology trends. Being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data, tried to see if we could make any sense out of this, and made a very surprising discovery, that if you measure the underlying information properties, like the cost performance of computing, or the number of bits that you can put on a magnetic substrate, and list 100 other things, the number of bits being moved around on the Internet, number of bytes of brain data that we're downloading, the spatial resolution of brain scanning, they form trajectories that are amazingly predictable. And what is predictable is that they're exponential. And it's a simple comparison, but people really don't get it. And the biggest criticism of these ideas, I call the criticism from incredulity. You saw Kevin Kelly, and he goes on in the movie in this way, just saying, well, look at these conclusions. They're ridiculous, QED, they're wrong, without any further explanation, because they are the implications of exponential growth are startling. But this is not just in the future. We've already seen this. If I take 30 steps linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, I get to 1 billion. It makes a huge difference. And we've seen a billion-fold increase in the price performance of computing since I was a student. When I was an undergraduate at MIT, well, in fact, I went to MIT because MIT was so advanced in the late 60s that it actually had a computer. And we all shared it, took up half a building, cost tens of millions of dollars. It was an IBM 7094, 32K of memory. Not bytes, it was 36-bit words, so it's 150,000 bytes, 2 microsecond cycle time, 2 cycles per instruction, so that's a quarter of a MIP. The computer in your cell phone today, in your Android, is 1 million times cheaper. It's 1,000 times more powerful, at least, probably more, like 10,000. So that's at least a billion-fold increase in the amount of computation per dollar. And we're going to do it again in the next 25 years. As you'll see, there's a slow exponential growth in the rate of exponential growth. It took us 3 years to double the price performance of computing in 1900, 2 years in 1950. It was 12 months in the year 2000. It's down now under 11 months. But again, it's not just computing. It affects everything we care about. I mentioned the genome, and we now have the software that biology is based on. Health and medicine didn't used to be an information technology. That's not ancient history. That's only a few years ago. Health and medicine was hit or miss. We would just happen to find things that, that work. Pfizer tested out this new blood pressure medication. Didn't work quite well enough. They asked the test subjects to send the medications back. The women sent them back. The men did not. That led to the discovery of Viagra. That's how drugs were developed. It's called drug discovery. And that's been automated to kind of systematically go through 10,000 compounds. But we didn't have the means of actually treating biology as an information process, which is fundamentally what it is. We have 23,000 little software programs in this. Okay, they're not written in C++. I think maybe they're Fortran, but they're written in three-dimensional proteins that interact in complex ways. But they are literally sequences of data. And it's actually not that much data. I mean, it's 800 million bytes total, but it's replete with redundancies. ALU, for example, is a lengthy sequence. It's repeated 300,000 times. There's lots of redundancy. If you have redundancy, you know, you can have lossless compression. So I do that analysis in the book. And there's about 50 million bytes after lossless compression in the genome. And that's assuming the junk DNA is important, which it is to some extent, and that it controls gene expression. But it's including the so-called junk or non-protein coding DNA. It's 50 million bytes. Now that's not simple, but it's a level of complexity we can manage. But we now have that software. We're also making exponential gains now in reverse engineering it, understanding how it works. I had a debate a few years ago with a biologist said, well, we'll never figure out protein folding. That's just this magical essence of biology that's beyond computation. But in the last year, we can now simulate protein folding and predict exactly how a DNA sequence, which leads to a linear sequence of amino acids, will fold up into a three-dimensional protein and predict that accurately by simulating that process. We also have the means now of changing our genes, not just in a baby, but in a mature individual. RNA interference can turn genes off by basically latching onto the messenger RNA and destroying it. That was recognized with the Nobel Prize just 3 years after it started to work, which is a definite acceleration. These things usually take decades. We have new forms of gene therapy that can add new genes. I'm involved with a project where we take cells out of the body, lung cells, scrape them out of the throat, add a gene in vitro, because the old forms of gene therapy involved sending in a new gene through a virus, and that would trigger the immune system. So we do it outside the body, expect that it got done correctly, replicate the cell a millionfold. It's another new technology. Inject it back in the body, goes through the bloodstream, ends up back in the lungs. So now you have cells in the lungs with your DNA, but with a new gene. And this has cured a fatal disease, pulmonary hypertension. There are hundreds of other drugs and processes in the development and testing pipeline using similar ideas. There's over 1,000 using RNA interference to turn genes off. There's one gene we'd like to turn off. Tiffany mentioned the Google 15, which reminds me of the freshman 15 with all of the great food that you have around here. We have an ancient gene called the fat insulin receptor gene that says, hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a great idea 1,000 years ago. Many of us don't need that gene today. What if we were able to turn that gene off in the fat cells? What would happen? Well, that was tried in animals, and these animals ate ravenously and remained slim, and it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes. They didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got most of the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. There are several pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring that idea to the human market. That's just one of the 23,000 genes we'd like to consider modifying. I mean, how long do you go without updating the software on your Android or your laptop, and it updates itself automatically every few days or every few hours? This software that runs in our bodies is out of date. It hasn't been updated in thousands of years. The fat insulin receptor gene actually is an ancient gene that allows animals to roam around and take their calories with them. Plants don't have a fat insulin receptor gene. And we can design these interventions on computers. We can test them out with biological simulators. All of these different aspects of health and medicine becoming an information technology are in an early stage. But now that it's an information technology, it will be subject to what I call the law of accelerating returns, this doubling in price performance, capacity, overall power of really all information technology. Doubling time depends on what you measure, but it's generally around a year. So these technologies will be 1,000,000 times more capable in 20 years, and it will be a different era. It's deeply affecting everything we care about, and you can certainly see the profound effect with your own work. We're tying together people with knowledge and information. We need our technology just to store it. Human knowledge is doubling every 14 months. Without Google, we would really not benefit from that knowledge. But you now have half the farmers in China going around with devices. They call them cell phones, but they are powerful computers and communication devices. They can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. It's really harnessing a real cultural revolution. And this ultimately putting very powerful technology, far more powerful than the nations commanded just a couple of decades ago, in everybody's hands, is really democratizing the world in many different ways. It's democratizing the world politically. As was mentioned briefly in the trailer, I wrote in the book, my first book, which I wrote in the 1980s, The Age of Intelligent Machines, that the Soviet Union would be swept away by the then emerging decentralized electronic communication, early forms of email using teletype machines, fax machines, kept everybody in the know, the paradigm of the authorities grabbing the central TV and radio station and commanding all access to knowledge wouldn't work anymore. And that's actually what happened in the 1991 coup against Gorbachev. The photo op was based on an old paradigm of Yeltsin standing on a tank, but this tank had nothing to do with it. It was the electronic communication that swept away the Soviet Union. And we saw a great wave of democracies during the 1990s as the web gained in power. And we can see the influence today of text messages and tweets and so on political processes around the world, such as the recent crisis in Iran. And it's also democratizing the tools of creativity. A kid in her dorm room now can create a full-length motion picture with a $500 HD camera and her PC. You used to have to be a Hollywood studio to do that. You can create a recorded album with the equivalent of millions of dollars of recording equipment of 10 years ago. I like to use the example of a couple of kids at Stanford who on their $1,000 laptops wrote a little bit of software as a dorm project and revolutionized web search. So really the tools of disruptive change are in everybody's hands. And I very often get asked about the have-not divide, but these technologies, by the time they work well, become very inexpensive and very ubiquitous. If you remember 15 years ago, if someone took out a mobile phone in a movie, that was your signal, okay, this person's a member of the power elite. And they didn't work very well. And then it took 10 years to put out the first billion cell phones. We put out the second billion in 3 years. We put out the third billion in 1 year. They're ubiquitous in Africa. There are many organizations now seeking to use those to bring high-quality education, health information, diagnostic capability all over the world using this ubiquitous communication. I'll give you one example of applying this to my own work. That's really the main reason I got into technology forecasting. It does have the side effect that we can now see not just a few years ahead, but 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, and that's been the source of material for my books. But I do use this to time my own technology project, because you need to time your projects, and that's really not a lesson I need to give here, but it is important around the world to plan projects that may take 2, 3, 4 years for the world that will exist when you finish the project, not for the world that exists now. And you can see how quickly the world changes. A decade ago, most people didn't use search engines. That sounds like ancient history, but that was not so long ago. So in 2002, I had a meeting with Dr. Mark Maurer, the head of the National Federation of the Blind, and we had worked together actually in the 70s on Kurzweil reading machine, which was the first print-to-speech reading machine. And it was about the size of that podium. It was larger than a washing machine and quite expensive and limited in capability. But libraries did buy them, and Stevie Wonder bought one, which led to my work in music synthesis. And over the years, they got smaller and smaller. But in 2002, it was still a device that sat on your desk. And a blind person or a dyslexic individual, we had hundreds of thousands of users, but they would have to bring material back to their desk to read it. And there's a lot of material as you go through the day that you'd like to read that you don't want to bring back to your desk or can't, like a sign on a wall or a bank ATM display or a menu in a restaurant. So I gave speeches very often at technology disabilities conferences, and so I'd say someday a blind person will be able to just take a device out of their pocket and read all the printed material as they go through the day, handouts at meetings, and so on. So Dr. Maurer said, well, Ray, you've been talking about this for many years. When is this going to be possible? And I said, well, according to our models of cell phone technology, portable computing, portable cameras, we'll have a cell phone that can support this application in 6 years, 2008, second quarter to be exact. And he said, okay, well, how long will it take to develop the software? And I said, well, we have to do more than just put the OCR and text-to-speech synthesis in the cell phone, which will take some engineering. We need a new layer of intelligent software, because as the blind person holds the device, there's 3 different degrees of freedom of tilt, rotation, there's uneven illumination, curved images. I mentioned 7 or 8 vagaries of images held, particularly by someone who can't see. We're going to have to give feedback to the user, telling them, okay, you've cut off the left edge, move to the left, and so on. He said, okay, I understand. How long will that take? And I said, about 6 years. So he said, okay, let's get started. And we worked together. They did the testing and the human factors. And sure enough, spring of 2008, cell phones that could support this application became available. And a little bit to my surprise, we actually got the software done on time. And there's now thousands of blind guys and gals and dyslexic students going around taking pictures of images as they go through the day and reading them out loud. I'll just read a passage from the book that we handed out.
Taking picture.
And it will rotate the image any amount.
Processing picture in books,
it's pretty,
articles, and labels format.
It will read in 16 different languages.
Camera is 0 degrees clockwise relative to the page.
we have permission, which we greatly appreciate, from Google to send out the text
265
and get it translated.
Civilization will experience, so it will take longer to mature than less complex technologies. It is characterized by the mastery of the most important and most powerful attribute of human civilization, indeed of the entire sweep of evolution on our planet, intelligence. It's the nature of technology to understand a phenomenon and engineer systems that concentrate and focus that phenomenon to greatly amplify it. For canceling, please wait.
Just to pick up on what the reader was reading, this is the nature of technology and engineering. It's a little bit different than science. It takes a scientific insight and principle and focuses it like a lens focuses sunlight, which is itself a technology, and can create really transcendent effects and solve problems. I mean, take Bernoulli's principle. It's a subtle scientific insight that says there's slightly less air pressure over a curved surface than a moving curved surface than a flat surface. And we still don't understand Bernoulli's principle. They're still arguing whether it has to do with thermodynamics and how that works. The science has not been settled, but engineering and technology did not wait for it to be settled. It created the whole world of aviation. And there's a few subtle insights, such as the von Neumann architecture that Babbage actually discovered in the 19th century, and Claude Shannon's information theorem, that you can create any accuracy of information transfer regardless of the inaccuracy of the channel, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. You can have extremely inaccurate channels, and you can transmit very accurate information, which in all of our information technologies would be impossible, including computation, which is moving information around inside a computer, if it weren't for that subtle insight. But technology has taken these insights and created the whole world of computation that ultimately will transform the world. So let me just very quickly go through and show you how ubiquitous and predictable these technologies are. And, well, these are logarithmic graphs. So the telephone took 50 years to be adopted by a quarter of the population. Cell phone did that in 7 years. There's been a continual acceleration in adoption times. And I was alluding to this earlier. It's a double logarithmic graph. On the x-axis, it's how many years ago this paradigm shift took place, and on the y-axis, it's how long it took for the paradigm shift to evolve. And so DNA took 1 billion years. The Cambrian explosion was only 10 million years. Biological evolution kept accelerating because it kept building on its own achievements. And Homo sapiens evolved in a few 100,000 years. And it leads smoothly to the evolution of technology, which started out a little bit faster than the evolution of the technology-creating species, tens of thousands of years for the first steps. And then we've always used the latest technology to create the next. And this forms a straight line on this double logarithmic graph. Some people criticized the graph and said, well, Kurzweil only put points on the graph if they fit on the straight line. If I had a paradigm that wasn't quite on the straight line, I didn't bother to include it. So I took other people's lists, 15 of them, Carl Sagan's Cosmic Calendar, the American Museum of Natural History, Encyclopedia Britannica, and so on. And there is some disagreement. So there's some spreading of the points, but there's a very clear trend line. Not much happened in 1 billion years ago. There's an undeniable acceleration. And the ongoing exponential growth is a series of S-curves. I mean, another objection to my ideas is that, well, Kurzweil takes these exponentials and just projects them out, and we all know exponential growth can't go on forever. You have 2 rabbits in Australia, you get 4 rabbits, 8 rabbits, 16 rabbits, but they finally hit a wall when they eat up all the foliage, or the villagers rebel against the rabbits. And indeed, we see the same thing in information technology. Specific paradigms run out of steam, but it then leads to research pressure to create another paradigm. And I do talk about in Chapter 3 of Singularities Near that there are ultimate limits to the ability of matter and energy to support computation and communication based on what we know about the physics of these phenomena. So there are limits, but they're not very limiting. And we'll we'll be able to go to devices that are trillions of times more powerful than the human brain before we reach those limits. And so here's the history of computation. There's a version of this graph in the Singularity is Near, which I also gave out when I was here in 2005. But that only goes through 2002. So we just updated this to 2008. I have some of my colleagues here from KurzweilAI.net who helped me to do that. We have a team of 10 people that helped gather this data. And not surprising to me, but it is remarkable. And I'd ask you to consider how remarkable it is at how predictable and smooth a progression this is. This is not some government-mandated program. This is not decided on by some consortium. This is not the output of a tabletop experiment. This is just what happened. This is a measure of human history, of the innovation and invention of millions of people over a century, and it forms this very predictable trajectory going back to the 1890 census. And it goes through different paradigms: electromechanical calculating, relay-based computers. Alan Turing cracked the German Enigma code with relay-based computer. Vacuum tube-based computers. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower in 1952 with a vacuum tube-based computer. And then they were shrinking vacuum tubes. Every year they were made smaller and smaller. I have a device that's really, we have a little museum of computers, and it's very tiny little vacuum tubes. They got to a point where they couldn't shrink the vacuum tube anymore and keep the vacuum, and that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. But it was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. We then went to the fourth paradigm, transistors, and finally the fifth paradigm, Moore's law. This is not just Moore's law. This goes back decades before Gordon Moore was born. And of course, this being a logarithmic scale, and with each level being 10,000 times greater than level below it, it kind of compresses the scale of the progress. So it doesn't look that impressive on this graph, but this represents trillions-fold increase in the amount of computation per dollar, a billion-fold just since I was a student. But it's an amazingly predictable phenomenon. It was not slowed down or affected at all by the Great Depression or any of the recessions or two world wars or the Cold War or any of the other things that happened in the 20th century. And these are different computers. This is Hans Moravec's graph, but the same phenomena. Supercomputers now up to a petaflop. There are different estimates of the amount of computation it would require to functionally simulate the human brain. My estimate is conservatively high at about 20 petaflops. That's only 3 years away. IBM has announced a 20 petaflop computer it's already building. Will go online in 2012. This does not include cloud computers like Google's computer that's already, I believe, past that point, although I don't know for sure. But, and I don't dwell on these examples of electronics, but this is one of my favorites. When I was a high school student growing up in New York, I would hang out at the surplus electronic shops on Canal Street, which are still there, and I'd buy something bigger than this for $50. It was a telephone relay with support circuitry, and it could switch a bit. In 1968, I could buy a transistor that did that for only $1, and now you can get $500 million for $1. You've heard of these fantastic comparisons, but I think what is even more amazing is look at how smooth a progression this is. This was not a plan. This is just what happened through all of the competition. And as we've made the transistors cheaper, they're smaller, so therefore they're faster. Although we've slowed that down a bit because of heat and energy issues and putting more into distributed computing, so now you have multi-core processors that are, they're still faster than the ones before, but we've slowed down the rate of increase in speed, because the brain is at the opposite end of that spectrum, where we have 100 trillion processors, but they're extremely slow, 200 calculations per second, and they don't generate much heat, and they don't use up much energy. So the cost of transistor cycle has come down by half about every year. That is a 50% deflation rate in information technology. So the Android you can buy now is costs less and it's better than the one a year ago. It's about twice the price performance. That affects everything from reading machines to phones to computers. And it's also true of every form of information technology, whether you're buying DNA data or brain data. The first genome cost $1 billion. NIH is now collecting 1 million genomes, not at $1 billion each, more like $1,000 each is their projected cost. And so depending on what week it is, the economists worry about inflation or deflation. Many are back on deflation with the economic downturn. We had massive deflation during the Depression. And the concern is, as more and more things become information technology, health and medicine is turning into an information technology. When we have full-scale nanotechnology, we'll be able to email a wide range of objects that can then be assembled out of molecular fragments with sort of three-dimensional printers. We already can see many physical products have become email attachments. And if I wanted to send you a movie, I used to send you a FedEx package. Now I can send you an email attachment, or a song, a book. Other things will become information files. And if there's a 50% deflation rate in information technology, the concern is people aren't going to actually double their consumption year after year to keep up with this. So the size of the economy, at least as measured, not in bits, but as measured in constant dollars, will shrink. For a variety of actually good reasons, that would not be a good thing. And that's not what we see. We actually more than double our consumption. This is bits shipped, but you can look at this trend on any other type of measure. And there's been 18% growth in constant dollars of every form of information technology, despite the fact that you can get twice as much of it every year for the same cost. And the reason is as new applications become cost-effective, search engines, music players, they explode on the landscape. People didn't buy music players for $15,000, which is what it would have cost 15 years ago. Just put up magnetic data storage just because this is not Moore's law. These are different engineers. It's a different engineering problem. Packing magnetic bits on a magnetic substrate, we see the same phenomenon. And I mentioned DNA sequencing cost. It's gone from $10 in 1990 per base pair to a small fraction of a penny today. This is smooth exponential growth, doubling every year in the amount of genetic data we've sequenced. There are many other similar biological projects, the proteome project, the connectome project, that are similarly scaling up at an exponential pace. Communication technology, which is deeply democratizing and which this organization plays a key leadership role in providing extremely high-quality information all around the world, and allows the harnessing of the wisdom of crowds through search engines or wikis. I mean, 10 years ago, most people would have expected, if you announced a encyclopedia, that everyone could write and anybody could edit any entry. People would think, my God, it's going to be filled with flames and graffiti. And it's amazing how good it is when you harness the wisdom of crowds in the right way. And this is democratizing it at many different levels. So this is the graph I had a little piece of in the 1980s. Just the first few points of the ARPANET. When it went from Department of Defense to the commercial sector, there was a little jump, but basically there's been exponential growth. If we look at the same data on a linear scale, it looks like this. So this is how we experience the world. The World Wide Web came out of nowhere, but you could see it coming if you looked at the exponential progression. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate. It's 100 in 3D volume per decade, both electronic and mechanical. So we are now building devices at the molecular level. One of the primary applications is, again, biology. If I were to say, well, okay, someday you're going to have millions of, or billions of little devices, blood cell size, traveling in your bloodstream, keeping you healthy from inside, a lot of people would think, well, that sounds awfully futuristic. There are already about 50 experiments of doing that with at least a first generation of blood cell size devices that are nano-engineered. One scientist cured type 1 diabetes in rats with a blood cell-sized device, lets insulin out in a controlled fashion. At MIT, they have a device that can detect and destroy cancer cells. These are all in an early stage now. But if you look at what we can do today, for example, putting a computer in your brain if you're a Parkinson's patient that replaces the biological neurons destroyed by that disease. The latest generation allows you to download new software to that computer. The computer is actually not in your brain. It's right outside your brain, but it's implanted in your body, and it communicates with that region of the brain. It's not pea-sized. It's not blood cell sized. It's pea-sized. But consider what we can do today and apply this billion-fold increase in price performance we'll see in 25 years, 100,000-fold shrinking in the size of three-dimensional features, and you get some idea of what will be feasible. This is an animation of a blood cell-sized device that Rob Freitas has designed, which is a robotic red blood cell. It's actually not that complicated. We have reverse-engineered red blood cells. They store and release oxygen and carbon dioxide in a controlled manner. And it brings up an interesting observation about biology. Biology is very intricate, but as you know, an evolutionary process, when we simulate them on computers, we'll find a local maxima, and there may be a peak or a better design that it hasn't discovered, far away in the multidimensional terrain. So there are a lot of assumptions that biology made, for example, building everything out of proteins, that are suboptimal. And as we reverse engineer biology and redesign it, we find that we can increase capacity 1,000-fold or 1,000,000-fold. These are about 1,000 times more powerful than natural red blood cells. So if you were to replace a portion of your red blood cells with these restipocytes, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. So, honey, I'm in the pool will take on a whole new significance. The interneuronal connections in our brain transmit information using electrochemical signals that travel a few hundred feet per second. That's 1,000,000 times slower than electronics. We'll have plenty of computation to do things like simulate all the regions of the human brain as we go through the 21st century. But the more interesting issue, one that we debated yesterday at Singularity University, is will we have the software? And understanding the human brain is not the only source of knowledge about intelligence. And in fact, AI has not used that very much because we have not been able to see inside the brain with enough resolution up until just recently. So we treated it like an engineering problem, and we've made some very good advances. There are hundreds of examples of narrow AI in use every day, like search engines, connecting cell phone calls, automatic diagnosis of electrocardiograms, automatic detection of credit card fraud, design of products, manufacturing of products in robotic factories, just-in-time inventory systems. I could list 100 other applications of software doing what used to be done by human intelligence. But we don't yet have the full range of human intelligence. And what is really going to accelerate that process is understanding the best example of intelligence that we have, which is the human brain. And the human brain has some specific strengths and some weaknesses. We fill in those weaknesses with our technology. I mean, no mathematician can hold up to Mathematica, and no human being can do what Google does. But human beings still have greater power of pattern recognition, although it's improving. But we're going to get substantial insights from understanding how the human brain works and how the neocortex works, which has one basic pattern recognizer organized in hierarchies, because we are uniquely capable of doing hierarchical thinking. I mean, that is what's behind our technology, our language. And no other species can do that nearly as well. Yes, chimps can put together sign language, simple sentences, but they don't have our strength of hierarchical thinking that comes from the neocortex. But we are doubling the spatial resolution of brain scanning every year. We're doubling the amount of data we're getting every year. And we're also showing that we can turn this data into working models and simulations of brain regions. This is a dozen regions of the auditory cortex that have been modeled and simulated by Lloyd Watson and his colleagues at a small company called Audience. There's a model and simulation of the visual cortex that has been similarly tested. We have models and simulations of the cerebellum, where we do our skill formation, like catching a fly ball. We always wondered, how does a 10-year-old kid do that? I mean, all she has to do is relate the movement of the ball to the movement of her hand, but you've got to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations to do that, and most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. But those formulas are solved in the cerebellum. The neocortex has actually taken over some of those functions and similarly solves those equations, but we have actually figured that out, and there are actually now some simulations of slices of the neocortex that I don't believe are actually quite accurate, because I don't think we understand how it does invariant feature detection yet. But we are making rapid progress in being able to turn this data into working models and simulations. I make the case in this book, Chapter 4, that we will have all the models and simulations of the human brain within 20 years. It'll give us three things. It'll give us better algorithms for our intelligent machines, for the very powerful computers that will exist then. It will give us better means of fixing the brain. And thirdly, it'll give us more insight into who we are, which has been the goal of the arts and sciences since there's been art and science. And I don't want to dwell on these, but it is the exponential growth of information technology that is fueling economic growth. And you hardly see the effects of even on a per capita basis, you can hardly see the recessions. You can see the Great Depression. It's a little dip there. But these curves always snap back to where it would have been had they not occurred in the first place. And this exponential growth of information technology continues completely unaffected by any of the economic downturns, including the Great Depression, and it's definitely including this current economic downturn. And what's fueling it is the greater productivity that information technology provides. Average hour of human labor has gone from $30 in the industrialized world to $130 in constant dollars in 45 years. And the adoption of these technologies is exponential. This is e-commerce, now a couple of $1 trillion on its way to being the biggest nation in the world, if it were a nation. And sometimes people ask, well, how come we don't see the dot-com boom and bust on here? That was a Wall Street phenomenon, not a Main Street phenomenon. The investment community looked at the internet and said, wow, this is going to change everything. This is going to turn every business model on its head. That was accurate. But it's not going to do that instantly, exponentially, which is ultimately quite transformative. But if you remember my internet graph, it was a decade before we started doubling big numbers, because we start out doubling tiny numbers. So Wall Street came back without a real understanding or model of the timing of this around the year 2000 and said, gee, it hasn't changed everything. It hasn't changed anything. I guess we were wrong, and all the values went the other way. Meanwhile, it was growing exponentially. You now have dot-coms like Google with many billions of dollars of revenue, and it is a real phenomenon. And intellectual property is soaring. Education, if you look at, we are destroying jobs at the bottom of the skill ladder. We create a larger number of jobs at the top of the skill ladder. 1900, a third of people worked on farms, a third worked in factories. Those are now 3% and 3%, but we have more employment, and the new jobs pay 8 times as much in constant dollars. These are some of the graphs from Larry Page in my study for the National Academy of Engineering. Basically, total amount of solar energy is doubling. This is a logarithmic scale every 2 years. It's 8 more doublings to hit 100%. And so let me, well, I'll show you one more demo, which is a speech-to-speech translation system. And it uses speech recognition from Nuance, which used to be Kurzweil Computer Products, and speech synthesis and Google translation. And
this is a demonstration.
It works quite well. It's about 99% accurate.
Dies ist eine Demonstration.
Of a prototype of a quote translating end quote telephone. Period.
Von einem Prototyp eines übersetzenden Telefons.
So I'll just sum up. By 2029, these technologies will be millions of times more powerful. We'll have completed the reverse engineering of the human brain. We will begin to integrate with this technology. There's already many computerized devices we are putting in our bodies and brains. It's at an early stage, but these will become blood cell size, and they'll be going inside our bodies, keeping us healthy, going inside our brains and putting our brains into the cloud, and providing full immersion virtual reality from within the nervous system, expanding our intelligence. I'll leave you with this trend. This is from the linear progression of health and medicine before it was an information technology. Life expectancy was 37 in 1800. But now that it's an information technology, this will go into high gear as we get to the mature phase of that biotechnology revolution, reprogramming the information processes underlying biology. According to my models, 15 years from now, we'll be adding more than a year every year, not just to infant life expectancy, but to your remaining life expectancy. So as you go forward a year, your life expectancy will move on away from you. So if you can hang in there, we may get to see the remarkable century ahead, and I look forward to working on it with you. Thank you. So I know some of you have to leave, but for those of you who can stay, I'm happy to answer some questions.
It's great to hear you speak. I use the age of spiritual machines in a class that I teach. You've shared how your predictions, your published predictions, have fared. Another measure of your predictions is how is your investment portfolio done?
Well, it's doing quite well, but that does not make long-term predictions. It's at the opposite scale of this. The long-term predictions, particularly if you measure things like MIPS per dollar, are very accurate for years, tens of years. My Fat Cat company, Financial Accelerating Transactions from Kurzweil Adapting Technologies, makes short-term predictions, 2 or 3 hours or 2 or 3 days, and they don't have to be 99% accurate. They can be 55% accurate. And then it makes lots of investments, and some win and some lose, and it's hedged long and short. But over time, then it can make money. So that's the philosophy. It's using pattern recognition on what is extremely noisy data, but there is a signal there. And it's doing well.
Hello, Ray. Thanks for speaking. You mentioned during your presentation that signals in the brain travel far slower than signals in current microcircuitry. I just want to elaborate on that. Over the next few decades, it may become cheaper and easier for my brain to communicate with your brain than it currently is for my left half to communicate with my right half. One possible side effect of this development is the complete loss of individual identity as we currently understand it in 2009. Can you comment on the continuing drastic decline in the cost and size of communications technologies and its implications for my sense of individual identity?
Well, it's a great philosophical question, and philosophical questions that have been quite abstract since Plato debated them 2,000 years ago will become real pressing questions. There are characteristics that we take for granted in our software that represent limitations today of biology. For example, my software, the software of our brains is embedded in the hardware. When the hardware crashes, the software disappears with it. That's not true of your computer. If you toss it out the window, you can recreate the personality and memory and skills of your computer because you've retained its mind file. We ultimately will get to a point where we can do that as well. And we can merge computers. You can take, as you've done, 1 million computers and make them one supercomputer, or they can then become individual computers. You can have individual identities that are completely unrelated to computers. You can have 10 processes running on one computer. You can have 12 processes running on 20 computers. I mean, there's no one-to-one correspondence. I think we will still retain our individuality. We'll have better ways of also merging our intelligence. We do that to some extent now in terms of wisdom of crowds, and the crowd can take on a personality. And electronic communication, I think, tends to enhance the wisdom of crowds rather than the wisdom of lynch mobs. But these are important issues which I think the design of the technology, we can continue to enforce our human values, which does retain some respect for individuality.
On that note, again, thank you very much, Dr. Kurzweil. It was a very awesome presentation. Thank you.